The blood was still fresh on the grass when the first male of the Ikati coalition stopped on the rocky ridge. He didn't roar, he didn't look back. He simply sat down, his dark mane caked with dust from the dry season, and watched the horizon for what must have been hours. The other two males arrived minutes later, each from a different direction, as if they had been patrolling the edges of an invisible territory. 3 adult males, none older than 7 years, all bearing marks from recent battles. The largest, his ribs showing through his thin frame and a scar cutting diagonally across his muzzle, had a torn left ear. The second was younger, with a lighter mane and a less robust body, but with a fixed stare that didn't blink in the wind. The third limped slightly from his right hind leg, though when he walked, he did so with a steadiness that denied the pain. What nobody says about a drought on the savannah is that it doesn't kill directly by starvation. It kills by thirst, yes, but above all, it kills by distance. When the prey move toward the last remaining watering holes, lions have to travel twice, 3 times as far to cover the same territory. And in that effort, the body begins to consume itself from within. The Ikati coalition knew this. They had gone 3 months without a full meal, but there was something these 3 males understood better than any other coalition in the region: the watch shift. They didn't take turns hunting, they took turns watching. While 2 rested in the shade of a dead acacia, the third patrolled the perimeter of their territory, an irregular rectangle of about 60 square kilometers. It wasn't the largest territory in the area, nor the richest in prey, but it was theirs. And in the dry season, territory is defended more with the eyes than with the teeth. The first male, the one with the torn ear, was patrolling the northern boundary when he found the tracks. They weren't from zebra or wildebeest. They were lion tracks, but not from his coalition. 3 sets of paw prints, recent, entering his territory from the east. He stopped, sniffed the air, and for several seconds didn't move. Then he turned and retraced his steps, not fleeing, but carrying the information. What the Ikati coalition did then was not what most would expect. They didn't roar, they didn't confront, they simply adjusted the watch shift. To understand why 3 male lions chose to watch instead of attack, you have to understand what the drought means in a territory of 60 square kilometers. It's not just the lack of water, it's the certainty that every calorie counts, every drop of energy, every wound that could become infected. In times of plenty, a territorial fight can end in minutes, with few consequences. In a drought, a lost fight isn't just a defeat, it's a death sentence from exhaustion. The rival coalition was there too, on the other side of the boundary. 3 young males, with no visible scars, likely exiles from some pride to the north. They were looking for territory, water, and whatever prey remained. But the Ikati didn't give them what they wanted. They didn't give them a fight. They took turns showing themselves. For 3 days straight, one of the Ikati would appear at each point along the boundary where the intruders could see him. He wouldn't roar. He wouldn't challenge them. He would simply sit on a high rock, or walk slowly along a ridge, or lie down in the shade of a dry bush, always visible, always present. The message was clear: this is occupied. The cost of entering will be higher than you think. The rival males would advance, retreat, then advance again. They tested the northern boundary, and there was the male with the torn ear. They tested the west, and the young one with the light mane appeared from the brush. They tested the south, and the limping male emerged from the heat, moving with a slowness that looked like exhaustion, but was precision. What nobody noticed then was the pattern. The Ikati weren't just taking turns watching, they were taking turns lying. Because while the watcher showed himself at one end of the territory, the other 2 weren't simply resting, they were hunting. Or rather, they were trying to hunt. In 3 days, they only managed to bring down a warthog calf, barely enough to keep them alive. But that mattered less than what the watching achieved. Each day the rivals hesitated. The Ikati gained time, and in a drought, time is measured in unspent calories. On the 4th day, however, something changed. The male with the torn ear was returning from his shift on the northern boundary when he found his younger companion drinking at a nearly dry waterhole. The water was murky, hot, with a muddy taste that no lion would choose if there were an alternative. But it was water. The young one was drinking greedily, his tongue skimming the muddy surface, when the older male stopped a few meters away. He didn't approach. He didn't growl. He remained still, watching, his gaze fixed on the horizon behind his companion. The young one stopped drinking. Something in the older male's posture told him this wasn't the time to quench his thirst. The young one stopped drinking because he knew how to read the older male's body. That's how survival works on the savannah. A pause that changes everything. If you want to keep seeing how these felines weave strategies that no documentary shows you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next move. And tell me in the comments, at what moment do you think the Ikati made their first mistake? The two stood there, motionless, for what seemed like an eternity, under the relentless sun. Then, without a sound, the older male turned and began walking east. The young one followed, water still dripping from his chin. They had been drinking at the most vulnerable point in the territory, the only place where, if the rivals attacked, the Ikati would be at a disadvantage. Not because of the water itself, but because of what the water meant, need. A lion that drinks is a distracted lion, and a distracted lion is a lion that can be ambushed. The rivals didn't attack that day, but the message was delivered. The Ikati had shown their weak point. And on the savannah, showing a weak point is an invitation for someone to test it. Over the next 2 days, the rivals came closer. They no longer just tested the boundaries. They began to move in. First a few meters, then 100, then almost a kilometer. Always at night, when the heat subsided and visibility was lower. Always in silence. The Ikati responded by tightening their shifts. Now they weren't just watching. They slept less, ate less, moved more. The limping male began to limp more heavily, his legs swollen from accumulated strain. The young one with the light mane lost weight visibly, the bones of his hips showing through his skin. Only the male with the torn ear seemed to maintain his form, though those who watched him closely noticed something different in his eyes. It wasn't fatigue, it was calculation. Because while the rivals moved in, he was mapping something in his mind. Not an attack plan, but a map of consequences. How much could they endure? How much could they lose before watching was no longer enough? And when was the exact moment when watching had to turn into something else? On the 6th day, they found the answer. The young male with the light mane was returning from his night shift when he smelled it before he saw anything. It wasn't the smell of a rival lion. It was the smell of fresh blood, mixed with the dry dust of the savannah. He followed the trail for almost a kilometer, moving stealthily through the thorny scrub until he found what was left of a young zebra. The rivals had hunted inside his territory. They hadn't just entered. They had killed. They had eaten. And they had left, leaving the half-devoured remains behind, like a signature. The young one didn't touch the meat. He knew it wasn't his, not because there was a law on the savannah forbidding it, but because this meat was a message. The rivals didn't need to leave anything. They could have devoured everything and left without a trace, but they left half. They left proof. The Ikati gathered at dawn, around the remains of the zebra, as the sun began to warm the earth. The 3 males looked at the meat, then at each other, and then back at the meat. There were no growls, no movement, only a stillness that lasted for minutes, until the male with the torn ear turned and began to walk. Not toward the remains, not toward enemy territory, toward the south, where the savannah became more arid, where there were almost no trees, where the horizon was a perfect line between white sky and ochre earth. The other 2 followed without question. They had understood that watching was no longer enough. The rivals weren't leaving. They weren't going to retreat. They had tasted the territory. They had tasted the meat, and now they believed the Ikati wouldn't attack. Or at least that's what they thought. What the rivals didn't know is that the Ikati had been watching something more than the territory. They had been watching the moment. And that moment, after 7 days of shifts, of hunger, of silence, had just arrived. The male with the torn ear stopped on a small rocky rise, about 3 kilometers south of where they had found the remains. From there, you could see the entire territory, the open plain, the few scattered trees, the murky waterhole in the center, and on the eastern boundary, the 3 rival males moving with the confidence of someone who believes they have won without a fight. The male with the torn ear watched the rivals for a long time. Then slowly, he turned his head and looked at his 2 companions. The young one with the light mane was trembling slightly, not from fear but from accumulated tension. The limping male had stopped limping. His leg, miraculously, seemed to have strengthened with the last few minutes of rest. All three knew what was coming, not because they had planned it, but because the savannah doesn't offer many options when your territory is reduced to the last line. The male with the torn ear sat down. The other two did the same. For several minutes, the three lions remained motionless, looking east, where the rivals kept moving, unaware they were being watched. They didn't roar. They didn't move. They simply waited for the sun to drop low enough for the shadows to start lengthening. And at that moment, when the light changed and the wind shifted, the Ikati rose together, not in a line, not in an attack formation, simply together, all three, walking at the same pace, in the same direction, with the same intention that needed no words. Because on the savannah, when three lions walk like that, the message is already written before the fight begins. The rivals saw them approaching from a distance. They stopped. They grouped together. They waited. For the first few seconds, there were no sudden movements. The Ikati kept advancing at the same pace, without hurrying, as if they had all the time in the world. The distance closed slowly. 500 meters, 300, 100. At 50 meters, the Ikati stopped. They didn't roar. They didn't threaten. They simply sat down. The rivals didn't understand what was happening. They had been expecting an attack. They had been bracing for a charge. But the Ikati didn't attack. They sat down at the edge of the territory, right where the rivals had hunted the zebra, and they stayed there, watching. The message was clear. We're here. We're not leaving. This is our territory. The meat you ate wasn't a victory. It was a debt. And on the savannah, debts always get collected. The rivals hesitated. They looked back, toward the east, toward where they had come from. Then forward, at the three Ikati sitting there, motionless, their gazes fixed. And for a long moment, no one moved. It was then that the torn-eared male did something none of those present had ever seen before. The Ikati didn't attack. They sat down, and in that gesture, they defined who they were. If this way of understanding power grabs you, subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this story, because on the savannah, debts are always collected, and what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about these felines. Tell us in the comments, what do you think that wait means? Patience, strategy, or a warning the rivals still can't read? He turned around slowly, showing his back to the rivals, the nape of his neck, the most vulnerable point of any lion, and he began to walk back toward the center of the territory, without looking back, without hurrying, as if the rivals didn't exist. The other two Ikati followed him. The rivals could have attacked at that moment. They could have charged at those exposed backs, at those defenseless necks. But they didn't. Something about the way the Ikati walked, in the absolute calm of that surrender, told them that if they attacked now, it wouldn't be an ambush. It would be a war they weren't sure they could win. The Ikati disappeared behind a low hill, and the rivals were left alone in a territory that no longer felt like theirs. That night, the rival coalition retreated, not to the east, but to the north, looking for another path, another chance. The Ikati didn't chase them. They didn't need to. They had won without a single fight, without a single wound, without a single drop of blood spilled. But the victory had a price, and that price was about to reveal itself. The young male with the light mane was the first to notice it. Upon reaching the center of the territory, where the murky water barely covered the bottom of the waterhole, the older male didn't drink. He lay down a few meters away, his head resting on his paws, and closed his eyes. It wasn't sleep. It was pure exhaustion. The exhaustion of 7 days without sleep, of walking without eating, of holding up a lie with his body. The three had spent more energy on vigilance than on any fight. And although the rivals had left, the drought was still there. The water was still scarce. The prey was still scarce. The victory hadn't filled their stomachs. It had only bought time. And time on the savannah is a loan that always comes due. The torn-eared male slept for 24 hours straight. When he woke up, the sun was high and the heat was suffocating. He stood up slowly, drank a little water, and began to walk north, toward the boundary where the rivals had disappeared. The other two didn't follow him. They knew where he was going. He was going to check if the threat was real, or if it had only been a mirage created by hunger and fatigue. He was going to see if the rivals had really left, or if they were waiting somewhere, crouched, ready to return when his guard dropped. He covered almost 10 kilometers in the hottest hours of the day, following tracks, scenting the air, examining every shadow. He found nothing. The rivals were gone, at least for now. But when he returned at dusk, he found his two companions standing, looking west. Not toward where he had gone, toward the west. The young lion with the light mane gestured with his head. On the horizon, a cloud of dust was rising slowly. It wasn't wind, it was movement. Something big was approaching. The torn-eared male sat down, his gaze fixed on that distant cloud. And for a long moment, he said nothing. Not because he didn't understand what it meant, but because he understood perfectly. The rivals had gone north, but the drought was bringing something else, something that no vigilance could stop, something that was coming from the west, from even drier lands, where the water had run out completely, and that something, when it arrived, wouldn't ask about the territory. It wouldn't ask about the coalition. It wouldn't ask about the rules the Ikati had established with their blood and their silence. It would just pass through, and the question the three males had to answer, as the cloud of dust grew slowly on the horizon, wasn't whether they could defend their territory. It was whether it would be worth trying. The wind brought the smell before the dust cloud became visible. It wasn't the smell of prey or arrival. It was the smell of churned earth, of dry sweat, of bodies in motion. The torn-eared male turned his head, nostrils flared, processing the information the air brought from the west. Something in his jaw tightened. The Ikati had survived the vigilance, the threat of the rivals, 7 days without enough food. But what was approaching from the horizon wasn't a coalition of lions. It was something that the strategy of taking turns, patience, and calculating consequences was useless against. The dust cloud was growing slowly, covering 1/3 of the western horizon. It wasn't compact, but elongated, like an irregular line stretching from north to south. Inside that cloud, the torn-eared male could make out moving shapes, some large, others small, all heading in the same direction. Wildebeest, hundreds of wildebeest, perhaps thousands. The Great Migration had arrived earlier than expected. On the savannah, the wildebeest migration doesn't follow a fixed schedule. It depends on the rains, the grass, the pressure from predators. But when it arrives, no territory can stop it. The wildebeest cross everything in their path: rivers, ravines, lion territories, hyena lands. They don't ask, they don't negotiate, they just pass through, like a living tide that recognizes no borders. The three Ikati watched the line of dust for what seemed like an hour, maybe more. The sun was dipping toward the west, tinging the cloud an orange color that made it look unreal, as if the horizon were on fire. The young male with the light mane was the first to move. He took a few steps west, head held high, eyes fixed on that growing line. It wasn't fear that showed in his posture. It was something more complex, a mix of alertness and opportunity. Because the wildebeest brought not only destruction, they also brought meat. Every year, during the migration, hundreds of animals fell. Old ones, sick ones, young ones separated from their mothers. The savannah filled with easy prey, with opportunities that didn't exist at any other time. But they also brought danger. A frightened adult wildebeest in a stampede could kill a lion with a kick, and a stampede of thousands of wildebeest left nothing in its wake. The torn-eared male didn't move. He kept watching, calculating, measuring the distance and the speed. He knew the wildebeest wouldn't reach the center of his territory until the next day, maybe two. They had time, but time wasn't what they needed. They needed to decide. The arrival of the migration changed everything. The boundaries of the territory no longer mattered, nor the rivals who had gone north, nor the murky water of the almost dry waterhole. What mattered now was how to hunt in the middle of a river of animals that wouldn't stop, how to choose the right prey without being swept away by the living current. The limping male sat down, his hind legs slightly raised. His gaze went from the horizon to the torn-eared male, waiting. He didn't need to ask. The question was written in the posture of the three bodies, in the way the wind moved their manes, in the silence that had settled between them. The answer came when the sun had almost disappeared. The torn-eared male got up, walked west a few meters and stopped. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for his companions to follow. He simply began to walk, with a slow but steady step, directly toward the dust cloud that was now tinged purple in the twilight. The other two followed without hesitation. They had understood the message. The vigilance was over. Now the hunt began. But what none of the three knew yet was that the migration brought not only prey, it also brought other predators. Hyenas, who followed the wildebeest like shadows, and other lions, entire coalitions that moved with the current, hunting on the flanks of the herd, waiting for the moment to attack. The Ikati would soon discover that the greatest danger wasn't the wildebeest. It was what came with them. They walked for hours, without rest, crossing the plain that was slowly darkening. The sound of the migration grew as they approached, a deep rumble, like a distant but continuous thunder, vibrating in the ground and in their chests. It was the sound of thousands of hooves pounding the earth, of bellows, of calves calling to their mothers. The torn-eared male stopped at the top of a low rise. From there, the view was overwhelming. The plain, as far as the eye could see, was covered in wildebeest. They didn't form a compact mass, but multiple currents that crisscrossed, separated, and rejoined. It was like watching a living river that constantly changed shape, without a clear pattern. The young male with the light mane sat beside him, panting slightly. The limping one arrived a few minutes later, his breath short, but his eyes bright. The three watched the spectacle in silence, letting the magnitude of what lay before them sink into their minds. Any lion on the savannah would have seen the migration as an opportunity, but the Ikati saw it as a problem. The Ikati saw a problem where other lions see opportunity. If you want to find out how these three brothers will face this unparalleled challenge on the plain, subscribe to join them on every step of their journey. And tell us in the comments, do you think they'll manage to hunt in the middle of that stampede, or will the migration overwhelm them? Any lion on the savannah would have seen the migration as a chance to feast, but the Ikati saw a wall of hooves and bodies, a threat that could crush them, not feed them. That difference in vision is what separates survivors from casualties out here. If you want to see whether these three brothers can rewrite the rules of the hunt, subscribe to stay with them through every twist of the plain. And drop a word in the comments. Write adapt if you believe they'll change their tactics, or perish if you think the stampede will swallow them whole. Because hunting in the middle of a stampede wasn't like hunting in their territory. There, they knew every rock, every bush, every path. They knew where to escape if something went wrong. But there, facing that sea of bodies, there were no landmarks. There were no escape routes, only a dense mass of animals moving without a fixed direction. To hunt there, they needed something they hadn't used in weeks. They needed to work together, but in a different way, not taking turns, coordinating in real time, moving as a single organism, reading the movements of the wildebeest before they happened. The torn-eared male came down from the rise and moved into the plain, walking parallel to the flow of wildebeest, staying about 50 meters away. The other two imitated him, each separated by about 20 meters, forming a line moving in the same direction as the animal current. They weren't trying to get close yet. They were studying. They watched which animals were lagging behind, which were limping, which seemed weak. They were looking for a specific target, a calf separated from its mother, or an old adult with a slack jaw, something they could isolate from the group before attacking. But the wildebeest also knew the lions were there. They didn't panic, but they moved slightly faster, closing ranks, protecting the most vulnerable in the center of the mass. For almost an hour, the Ikati followed the current, waiting. And then, it happened. A wildebeest calf, barely a few weeks old, became separated from its mother while trying to cross a small ravine. The mother noticed almost immediately and turned to look for it, but the current pushed her forward, away from her calf. The calf bleated, a sharp, desperate sound that lost itself in the general noise. The young male with the light mane saw it first. Without hesitation, he quickened his pace, veering off the line to approach the ravine. The torn-eared male followed him with his gaze, adjusting his own movement to cover the flank. The calf was alone, trembling, looking in every direction. The young male approached slowly, hugging the ground, using the sparse vegetation to hide. But the passing wildebeests noticed his presence and began to bellow, alerting the others. The young male hesitated. He knew that if he attacked now, he could bring down the calf with ease. But he also knew that the attack would alert the entire herd, and in seconds, hundreds of wildebeests could turn and charge at him. He looked back, searching for his companions. The torn-eared male had changed direction. He wasn't approaching the ravine. Instead, he was moving parallel to the current, away from the young male. The limping male did the same, but in the opposite direction. The young male understood. They weren't going to help him hunt the calf. They were going to create a distraction. The torn-eared male roared. It wasn't a roar of threat, but a deep, prolonged sound that spread across the plain. Several wildebeests lifted their heads, nervous. The limping male also roared from the other side, and the wildebeests began to cluster, moving away from the ravine where the calf was. The calf was left alone, exposed, without the herd's protection. The young male attacked. He ran the few meters that separated him from the calf, leaped, and brought it down with a blow of his paw. The calf bleated once, briefly, and then fell still. The young male didn't stop to eat. He grabbed the body by the neck and began dragging it south, away from the main current, while the other two Ikati held their positions, making sure no wildebeest strayed toward him. When he was at a safe distance, the torn-eared male and the limping male abandoned their posts and joined him. The three sat around the calf, breathing heavily, sweat glistening in their fur. They didn't roar in triumph. They didn't celebrate. They simply began to eat, in silence, while the migration continued passing a few hundred meters away, indifferent to what had just happened. The calf wasn't enough for the three of them. It was barely enough to calm the most urgent hunger, to restore a little energy to their exhausted bodies. But it was something. It was the first solid food the Ikati had gotten in nearly 10 days. While they ate, the torn-eared male lifted his head several times, looking toward the west, where the migration continued flowing without end. It wasn't a look of satisfaction, but of concern. The wildebeests wouldn't stop. They would keep passing for days, perhaps weeks, and each day, the Ikati would have to hunt again, risk again, expose themselves again to the danger of the stampede. But also, each day, other predators would arrive. He could already smell them. Hyenas, to the north, and further away, to the east, the scent of other lions. The Ikati weren't alone in this hunt. The migration had opened the hunting season for everyone, and the competition would be fierce. The torn-eared male finished eating, licked his paws, and lay down on the dry grass, his head resting on his paws. He didn't close his eyes. He kept looking toward the west, toward the endless flow of wildebeests, as the sun finished setting and night began to cover the savannah. The other two lay down beside him, forming an imperfect triangle, their warm bodies protecting each other. They didn't speak.